Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Expedition Race webinar. Absolutely delighted this evening that Renee McGregor is joining us. We are going to be talking about nutrition. Before we get started, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So we have a chat function, a Q&A function. If you have any questions, please drop them in there and we will do our best to answer them towards the end, like the last third of this session. My colleague Eleanor is joining us tonight. Thanks, Eleanor, for giving up some of your time. Eleanor will be answering questions on the Q&A. So if you were to ask us something like, what's the menu for Dragon's Back? Eleanor will fire you a link straight away to the website. And then towards the end, Eleanor will take over and kind of field the questions you've posted into the chat for Renee and I to answer. So nutrition, it's one of the most popular topics we have in terms of customer service inquiries, in terms of chatter on social media. Everybody has an opinion and everyone has an approach that works for them. What I'm really delighted this evening is to have Renee with us, because Renee's one of the leading sports dietitian and a real expert in this area. She's written a couple of books, Fast Fuel, Training Food, and More Fuel You, which I'll just put it there. I am almost finished reading right now. I've got just a couple of pages to go. It's a fantastic book, and it's really been maybe a bit of a breakthrough book in terms of my friends in the running world have been talking about this book and what's in it. So welcome, Renee.
Thank you so much for having me, and also those lovely words about my book. It makes it all worth the hard work when you're sitting there writing for hours and hours. It's lovely when you get that feedback, so thank you.
No problem. So let's jump in the first question. Perhaps you could just tell us about your professional background and the career that's led you to becoming this renowned sports dietitian.
So I started life doing a biochemistry degree because I've always been fascinated by the human body and how it works. I'm a bit of a nerd. I want to understand the human body. Now I'm even more interested in like the human behavior and how it all fits together, because I think, again, we tend to separate mind and body, and actually we need the two to work together to be really healthy. So I started life as I did doing a biochemistry degree, and on the back of that I was really, really interested in the nutrition component of my degree. And so I was encouraged by a mentor at university to think about going into dietetics. So I did a postgrad in clinical dietetics and ended up working actually in the NHS for about 7 years. And during that time, I basically covered everything. So dietetics is really similar to medicine in that you sort of start as an entry grade, like a junior, you do everything, you cover a zillion wards, and you basically get to know all the potential ailments and conditions that are out there, because it's really good for your knowledge to know how to respond, but also you're learning about how to be part of a multidisciplinary team and how to interact with consultants and nurses and physios, and how that all comes together. So you're looking after that person really holistically. You're not just looking after that person from your own centered approach. So I did that for 7 years, and I was like, it was kind of, I think it was around, I don't remember exact dates, but something like 2009-ish, when I decided that I wanted to move away from the NHS and pursue something a bit different. I've always been really, really sporty. Like, I was in all the sort of teams at school. I think I did better at sport than I did academically, and my parents struggled with that, but they got over it. And so I think by this point I had two young children as well, and I was struggling with kind of coping with some of the clinical conditions I was working in, and being a mum, it just felt quite tough emotionally on me. So took some time out, and then basically did a third degree, if you want to call it that. Did a postgrad in applied sports nutrition. Um, and this then has fundamentally led to where I am today. I mean, I started off work at Bath Uni, was very, very fortunate that I got the role there and ended up working with the rhythmic gymnastic team that went to 2012. And on the back of that, then was asked to work in both the capacity of a sports dietitian, but also as like sports science lead for both wheelchair basketball and wheelchair fencing going into Rio. So I had this kind of very big job over the course of going into Rio, and then sort of came back from Rio and I don't know, reevaluated. Working in sport is amazing, but when you're working in that very high level professional background, it takes you away from your family quite a lot. And I think just got to the point where I was like, is this what I really want? And I love what I do and I love working with people, but I also didn't want to be elitist. I wanted to be able to offer my services and my knowledge and my experience to as many people as possible. So it was like 2017, I decided to sort of start up my own sports nutrition consultancy. And so since then, I've been working with everybody and anybody, including still very high level professional athletes, because they still keep coming back, which is great. And now have like a team of people that work for me as well, just because we're quite busy. So that's kind of how I've ended up here, really. And I love running. I'm a big runner, and I always like to. I mean, think it's really important to understand what you're working in. So as a runner, it means that not only do I give that I can give that professional aspect, but also sometimes you can give your own, well, I tried this and it worked for me. I'm not saying it'll work for you, but but you also understand, what it feels like to bonk, what it feels like to actually get your salt balance wrong. And so understanding that and having that understanding, I think makes it easier to then find the solutions. So yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
I think what comes across loud and clear to me is that wonderful combination of kind of being a runner yourself and understanding us as a community, but also that kind of professional rigor of qualifications and training and experience that really brings an extra dimension when you're looking for advice from a professional. Okay, so I thought the best place to start was with the basics. So perhaps you can just describe the core components of any kind of healthy diet to fuel, healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the one that is so important to get right. Like if we get the foundations right, only then can you start layering up with weird and wonderful ingredients if you want to. And I always say this to when I'm working with junior athletes. They always come in and they go, I want to use protein powder and I want to use creatine and I'm like, well, we're not doing any of that until we've got the foundations right. And the foundations are very similar to what you would encourage for a healthy balanced diet, not generally, but the timing and the composition of your meals might be slightly different depending on, to a certain degree, your level of training. So if you're training for an event like the Dragon's Back or Cape Wrath or any of these kind of more longer distances, it takes quite a lot of commitment in terms of your training. You're not going to just be out there 2 or 3 days a week. You're going to be training 4 or 5 times a week most likely, and possibly doing a bit of cross training as well in terms of getting the strength in your legs. And so you're basically being very active all the time. And
Yeah.
so the complex carbohydrate component of your diet is really, really important. So making sure that you are including a really good intake of your breads, your pasta, your rice, your couscouses, your quinoa, your potatoes, your oats. These are all really, really key. And the timing of nutrition, particularly. So ensuring that, one of the key aspects of sports nutrition that has come through, particularly over the last few years, has been this notion of carbohydrate availability. So the body needs a source of carbohydrate in order to be able to perform well, but also in order to ensure that you get the sort of hormonal release that is needed for progression and adaptation. And that's the bit that a lot of people don't appreciate. I think, carbohydrates have had quite a bad press over the last 5 to 10 years for various reasons, and a lot of people promoting more lower carb approaches. And while they may work for a short term, they definitely don't work longer term. And they can actually cause more consequences, particularly on your health and then your performance. So complex carbohydrates are really, really critical. So that's the kind of the foundation of your diet should be kind of the complex carbohydrate. And then looking at your recovery, this is another big thing that people are not always sure about, is well, what does that mean? And we hear a lot about protein for recovery, which is, again, absolutely correct. But it is the combination, again, of carbs and protein together that are needed, particularly when you're doing an endurance event like running, because every time you go out for a run for an hour and a half, you are fundamentally depleting your glycogen stores, and these need to be replenished ahead of your next run. So you need that combination of both carbs and protein. The carbs, obviously, to replenish the glycogen stores, but we know that if you add protein to the mix, that actually is enhanced. So you get an enhanced absorption of glycogen, but also you adding the protein to the mix, you're repairing those muscle tears that occur every time you go out for a run. You're restoring, you're kind of like replacing the muscle that's been broken down as such. So the carbohydrate and protein, and then we still also need to include essential fatty acids. So, things like your seeds and nuts and oils. If you're not plant-based and you do eat fish, oily fish, like these are really, really important, because not only are they important from a reduction of inflammation, which again happens when you're doing a lot of training, they're also really important for our cognitive function and our brain health. And actually, although you might think, well, what does a runner need brain for? Well, actually, you need your cognition to make very smart decisions when you're out on the course. So, you do need to be thinking about this mix of carbs, protein, fats, as you would in everyday life. But it's more around the timing and the kind of the composition, I guess, and also where it differs from daily healthy eating is that if you're doing longer runs, particularly once you're out starting to do these 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, out doing these runs, you need to be thinking about how you fuel those as well, because your body can't maintain those paces. It can't maintain that endurance without fueling them. And that's, I think, where a lot of people sometimes struggle, because they don't know what they should have, and it doesn't always fit with their version of health, because a lot of people, they're a bit worried about the amount of sugar they're consuming. But what I'm going to say to you is that the human body preferred currency of energy is glucose. It likes glucose, it needs glucose, it works really well on glucose. And if the brain doesn't get enough glucose, it actually becomes quite anxious. It becomes like it turns on this threat mechanism that something's wrong. And actually, anxiety levels can increase, but also you can start getting into this more fight or flight place. So you don't perform as well. So it's, like I said, it's not that dissimilar to healthy eating. Obviously, fruit and vegetables also count. But one thing you have to be careful about with fruit and vegetables, particularly when you're in this heavy training sort of phase, is that you don't want to displace your carbohydrate for fruit and vegetables. This is a common thing I see, is people will pile their plates with vegetables, which is great, like it's good for you, but it can displace, say, the pasta or the rice and fill you up, and then you don't get the delivery of the energy that you need to be able to go and do the training you want to do. So it's kind of just being mindful of that as well.
That's fascinating. And I sit here as a very active runner, and I just want to ask all these personal questions straight away about how I can optimize my nutrition. So I'm gonna I'm gonna think about our participants, and having very clearly laid out what those foundations look like, perhaps you could then take it the next step and think about how that runner kind of maybe rethinks the nutrition as they start doing this training, as they're building up to a big stage race or a non-stop race.
Yeah, I mean, when I start working with somebody new who comes in and says, like, this is my goal, this is what I'm working towards, the first thing we tend to do is look at, okay, what does your training schedule look like? What does your day, because obviously majority of us who sign up for events like the Dragon's Back, we also have families and we also have jobs. So we're fitting training around quite a complex um lifestyle, and
Mm.
so we have to think. And so nutrition has to be easy, it has to be simple, it can't be complicated and convoluted, otherwise you're just not going to do it, and then it's going to have an effect on how you perform. But also, I think one of the things I'm really focused on is making sure that nutrition is not um it's not weird. And I say that, what I mean is that you can eat, you can eat it, your wife can eat it, or your partner can eat it, your kids can eat it. It doesn't have to be singled out as I'm the runner and I need this special meal. Because I think um it's that's the bit that I think often gets people confused is, well, how do I do this? So we start with looking at, when are you training, when are your key sessions, like when are the longer run, when maybe you're doing some harder stuff, some hill reps, some, maybe some kind of interval or tempo-y type work. Maybe you're not, and it doesn't matter. I'm not here to tell you how to train, but we look at the training schedule, and then we um look at kind of where that fits in. So are you running early morning? Are you running in the evening? Are you running at lunchtime? Because again, we're trying to fit this around our lifestyles. And then you can start to sort of put the blocks in. So if you've got somebody who has to do their running in the morning, an early morning, one of the big mistakes I see is that people then don't fuel. They tend to do all their runs fasted. And while it's okay to do the occasional run fasted, if you do all your runs fasted, you're potentially putting yourself at risk of injury and potentially increasing your risk of illness as well. And you don't always get that, like we say, we don't get that progression and adaptation because you're not fueling your body properly. So I'm not saying you need to sort of have a massive bowl of porridge and at 5 a.m. and then go out at 6 a.m. I mean, you can, we're talking about actually some quick tips are you could have a glass of juice. It's making sure that carbohydrate availability again is kind of key. So you could have a glass of juice and then head out. You could have a banana and then head out. You could have a slice of toast and head out. And the good thing about this as well is it's starting to train your gut. Like on race day, when you're in multi-day races. I mean, I just came back from doing a multi-stage race in Nepal, and we had to have breakfast at 6:30, and we were running by 7:15. So you're like trying to you have to get used to this if you're going to do these multi-day races. So it's a good way of kind of training the gut as well and working out what works for you. And again, when you're on multi-day, you're taking some of your fuel, you're fueling with you, and you can work out, well, actually, I can have porridge 45 minutes beforehand, and then I can run, or actually, I'm going to have a cereal bar, and then I'm going to start fueling really quickly during the run to make sure I keep my energy levels up. So these are little things you can start to learn about yourself.
Mm.
Um, so making sure that you are choosing the right fuel before, but also understanding that you're fueling appropriately in the evenings as well. So making sure that your evening meal is that kind of balance of what we've talked about: carbs, protein, vegetables, fats. And again, these don't have to be gourmet. We're talking, it could be pesto pasta with roasted vegetables, and some salmon or some tofu or whatever, depending on whether you eat fish or not. It could be something like a baked potato, you know,
Yeah.
even the I mean, I love a baked potato. It's one of my favorite meals before running. And I tend to, my favorite is like often a baked potato, roasted vegetables and hummus. That's kind of my go-to. Um, it could be, it doesn't have to be, like I said, it doesn't have to be like this massive gourmet and it doesn't have to have all these weird and wonderful ingredients. Get the complex carbs right, get your protein in there, make sure you've got some essential fatty acids, and you can create, your meal. But the key thing is knowing when to fuel. So if you've decided, like if you are doing a harder session on a Tuesday night, which tends to be the sort of typical night that a lot of people go and do a harder session, what you need to be thinking about is actually you need to be thinking about that 24 hours beforehand. So what you eat on Monday night through Tuesday is going to be really important to make sure that if you're doing a harder session, you've got enough energy available in your muscles to deliver that session and then get the benefits of it. And again, people often think about what they're eating the meal before, the snack before,
Yeah.
rather than the whole sort of 24 hours before that can have an impact. Um, so those are really important to think about. And then also, like we said, the recovery aspect of it. Again, there's a lot of talk about this 30-minute window of when you should get
Mm.
recovery in. And ideally, if you are training most days, that does actually stand, because you want to be replacing the glycogen stores as quickly as possible. You want to be getting that recovery, and especially sometimes people do a session on a Tuesday night and then go out for a run on a Wednesday morning. There's very little time to recover between that, so you want to make sure that you do get that recovery within that 30-minute window. And again, ideally that would be a meal of some description, eggs on toast, beans on toast. It would have that combination of carbs and protein. But it can also be a drink. Like if you really struggle to eat, and a lot of people do immediately after a hard session, then actually that's where using things like, if you do use cow's products, if you do use dairy, that's where like your cow's milk and your chocolate milk, that's where that all has come from. But actually, if you want alternatives, you can use something like a pea protein isolate and make that up with oat milk, and you still get that same kind of combination of carbs and protein. So it's trying to make sure that you're thinking ahead all the time of what you need.
I mean, well, again, we've covered quite a lot of ground there. So I'm gonna maybe I think I'm quite engaged with the topic, and I'm kind of struggling to maybe hold all that information in my head myself. Um, can you give us any kind of like go-to rules of thumb that you might offer to runners as they're kind of doing this preparation for their training?
My go-to is probably make sure that every meal has carbs, protein, and fats and veg in it. I definitely would say that. And I think as a kind of sort of baseline is ideally trying, your plate. If you're looking at your plate, you're looking at a minimum of like a third of your plate being the carbs, and then perhaps your protein and your veg make up the rest. But if you are going to um if you're doing a longer run, or so for example, if you're doing a longer run at the weekend, then you might want to, over the couple of days beforehand, slightly increase that carbohydrate intake so that it takes up a little bit more space on your plate than it does normally, just so you're making sure you've got those glycogen stores ahead of time.
Okay. I mean, it's fascinating. So when we now we're going from our training phase and we're going to the event, I mean, maybe you could kind of outline what you would consider a good nutritional fueling strategy for a multi-day event.
Yeah, so the things I'd be thinking, obviously, during the training, I'd be practicing as much as possible with the fueling that I'm going to do during the race. So, including when you're doing multi-stage, it's actually quite useful to think about trying some of the potential meals that you might be getting or you might be using if you're taking your own. Or every race is different, so it sort of depends on the race. But knowing what's available can be really helpful. And then making sure that those couple of days, those few days beforehand, that what I normally suggest is, if your race starts on a Saturday, then actually Wednesday, Thursday is where you want to do the work, in terms of where you want to make sure that you're increasing the composition of your diet so it's much more carb heavy during that. It doesn't mean increasing your overall intake, but just that it's much more carb heavy. And then on the Friday, you can relax a little bit if you're traveling or whatever, but also often you're a bit nervous and a bit kind of uncomfortable and stressed, and you might not want to eat quite as much. But actually, if you've done the work Wednesday, Thursday, then you're ready to go come Saturday. And then the strategy I would be encouraging you to think about is, as we talked about, knowing what you can eat before and sticking with that. Hydrating obviously is a key thing as well, and in this country it's so difficult. Like, the temperature can vary so much, and in September you never know. You could have boiling hot, you could have freezing cold, you could have really soggy, but equally, in April, June, July, the same thing. You just don't really know what you're going to get. So again, understanding your fueling requirements, and it's a really difficult one. Hydration requirements. Hydration's a really tricky one because it's actually very individual depending on you, and it's quite a difficult one to give advice on, because there are some generics we can use, and I'll go through those in a second. But I think it's important to remember that we are all different, and men and women are also very different. So ideally, with hydration, obviously the fluid, the water side of it is important, but equally we have to make sure that you're taking electrolytes to help draw that water in, particularly when you're running and you're losing a lot of salts as well. And so again, practicing with electrolytes, making sure you've got a nice variety is what I would recommend, because you get very bored of the same flavor day in, day out. And that's a top tip from me. So making sure you know that you've got lots of different options, and also contingencies, like, you might always use your lemon and lime, but always have a backup of a ginger or an orange just in case, because you just never know what you're going to feel like on the day. With the salt, it's really quite critical. People don't appreciate, particularly in ultra distance type events and then the multi-stage, people don't realize the importance of electrolyte balance. Often the change in electrolyte balance is the reason why people don't finish, because that's what makes them sick. That's potentially what can cause them to stop and not be able to take fuel in. And obviously, if you can't take fuel in, you can't really continue. So getting your electrolyte balance right is really, really important. So we tend to suggest, and like I said, it's a very ballpark figure, but we tend to suggest somewhere between 700 and 900 milligrams of sodium per litre of fluid you consume. So that's quite, it is generic, because some of us will be much higher sodium losers, so we will actually need a lot more, and some of us might be a little bit less. And it's kind of working out what's right for you. In addition, when you're female, if you're in the second half of your menstrual cycle during the race, so you're in that luteal phase of your cycle, your salt losses will be higher because your core temperature tends to be higher and you actually have higher losses. So you might need to adjust your intake even according to that. So it's quite useful to kind of maybe get an idea in these months leading into the races, what is going on with your body, and really respond to that, because even as somebody who's in the know, I've got it wrong in races, and it can fundamentally ruin your race. So getting your salt balance is really, really important. Um,
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I've got decades of running experience in the mountains and I still get it wrong every now and then. Normally through lack of concentration or not giving enough respect to the race distance or time that I'm doing. Again, you're a runner yourself. Some of our participants love their gels and their bars and carbohydrate powders. And I was talking to Lisa Watson, Dragon two times Dragons Back winner on the Great Lakeland 3 day last weekend, and she talked about eating leftover pizza. That was one of her favorites. Do you have advice? Do you have a preference yourself for kind of, I guess, whole foods or sports food?
yeah, I mean, I like food. I'm not gonna lie. But I think there is I think it's working out the strategy that works for you. When I'm working with athletes, depending on the distance, depending on what the intensity is also going to be of the running, and the terrain, all of those things come into play. And I think sports nutrition fundamentally does have a place, but you don't have to rely on it. But equally, if you find that that's what works for you, then that's also important. I think the biggest piece of advice I can give is practice, 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 and really work out what works for you. So for me, it's definitely a combination of real food and sports nutrition. I tend to use my sports nutrition almost as a bit of a backup for when I'm really fatigued and I know that I just can't chew because I'm just too tired. Or if I know I just need, like, sometimes I will do, if I've climbed and I know I've got a technical descent and I want that little bit of edge, I want to make sure my brain's got enough sugar, then I tend to take a gel at the top of that. I might even take a caffeine gel at the top of that, and then I know that I've got the energy there, because you forget that the climb is going to have taken quite a lot of energy out of you. And so some symptoms, like some things to look out for, is you start tripping up quite a bit, if you're kind of like staggering a little bit more, you keep making mistakes. Those are the things that's telling you that your central nervous system is quite tired now and your brain is needing something. So I tend to mix it up a lot. I use a lot of boiled sweets as well. So I find that if um if I have a boiled sweet in my mouth, particularly on a climb, especially if I'm using poles, because it's quite difficult sometimes to use poles and climb at the same time. So I find if I have a boiled sweet in my mouth, again, that just gives that constant sense of sugar to my brain that allows me to keep moving forward. And I probably in those on the climbs will rely more on energy in my drinks rather than eating. But I definitely eat a lot. I tend to eat a lot of bagels. Um, I'm a big fan of Snickers bars, and salted potatoes. I mean, mini cheddars, you name it. I mean, I'll eat most things. And again, I've practiced over the years what works, but I always have a contingency as a backup. When I was in Nepal, I was obsessed with, don't ask me why, I was obsessed with cheesy oatcakes. Absolutely obsessed with them. Like it was ridiculous. They're quite dry, but I've just like, this is what I want to eat. So, like I said, it's always good to try lots of different things. And again, it's important to think about that as well. Like you probably will like real food as well because it's salty, and you do get to the point where you want salty food. And so when you're doing something where you're doing a lot of kind of fast hiking or like climbing up, you've got the opportunity to probably digest a little bit more.
Yeah.
If you were doing a very fast race, it's a flattish, fastest race, and you want to, that's when you probably want to rely more on your sports nutrition because it's absorbed quickly into your body, and you can, you can take it on the run and off you go. So I vary it, and there's this general consensus that we should all be trying to take on between 60 and 90 grams of carbs per hour, which is kind of what's generically recommended out there. And again, I would say find out what works for you. Because again, we're all different, men and women are different. Something I've observed through my years of working with athletes is that generally speaking, up to 12, 15 hours, that probably does work. Then it's 60 to 90 grams of carbs. Once you start getting into the realms of like 24 hours, and I'm not saying anybody here is going to do that, but once you start getting into the realms of kind of 24 hours, your body doesn't deal with that as well, because at the end of the day we have our circadian rhythms and that interferes with kind of absorption and stuff. So, and I think you don't have to get it nailed every single time. That's something else that people panic about, is like, oh, I only got, I got 50 this time and I got sort of 70 last time. That's okay, like that's fine, because that will even out, and that's not a problem. So don't panic. I think one thing, there's a lot of talk about, can we manage more? And it's individual. The science out there demonstrates that some people can take 100, 120, maybe even a bit more grams of carbs per hour, but it's quite limited. Like the studies have been very, very small. They've mainly been done on men. And they've mainly been done on fast courses. So I think you have to be sort of mindful of that. And so again, I go back to, it really is about trial and error. But I think, like I said, for myself, I'm very aware that when I get to the point where I can't think, I just automatically will take sports nutrition because I know it's going to deliver what I need. But it's always nice to have things to look forward to as well. So like knowing you're going to have your Marmite bagel or whatever it is you're going to have, like it kind of is almost quite comforting, and gives you something to work towards as well.
I think one of the interesting things you said there was about kind of being bothered to eat some food when you're feeling you're not concentrating on as much, or you're tripping up. And we'd always give the same advice to participants about putting on an extra layer. If you think you're cold, put on an extra layer. If you're not sure where you are, stop and look at the map. And it's being bothered as soon as you think about something to deal with it, and don't kick it down the road, which is so easy to do. And I think we've all done that with 10K to go, and you think, well, I'll eat at the end, and then the last 5K really drag.
Yeah, totally.
So again, Dragon's Back Cape Wrath, one of the, I guess, features of the event is that we have a meat and fish free menu. So we're serving those main meals to participants: breakfast, snacks in the afternoon, evening meals. Perhaps you could just give us a sense of what you feel about that, because it is unusual.
It is unusual, but I mean, I don't think it's I don't think it's a problem. at all. I mean, again, like having just come back from Nepal, that was also meat and fish free. So we managed, and I think some people may struggle in the, especially if they do tend to rely on animal products for their protein. They won't struggle in terms of physiologically struggle, but they may struggle in terms of, because they're used to having, they're used to having chicken, or they're used to having fish or whatever, it might not feel like the meal is quite complete for them. And I think sometimes people can also feel that it might not fill them up as much, because obviously fish and meat does have this satiety factor. But it's also really difficult to digest. So actually on multi-stage races, it might not always be the best thing to be having the meat and the fish, because it takes a lot longer for your body to digest it. So I think having a sort of a meat-free diet is not a problem. And actually, as long as the kind of you're getting the combinations of grains and beans across the day, it doesn't even have to be in the same meal, then you're going to make sure you're getting all your amino acids, which is obviously key for the protein recovery side of point of view. But also meat-free diets do then tend to have a higher carbohydrate content, which is exactly what you need in these circumstances. So from my point of view, it's not something that I have any issue with as a dietitian, professionally speaking. I think people can absolutely get what they need. And when you're talking about race conditions, you know, you're talking about a week, 10 days max. Actually, if you don't get every single nutrient you need in that time in terms of micronutrients, then it's not going to do you any harm. Obviously, if you don't get micronutrients for a very long period of time, then that's a bit more problematic. But again, a very good, well balanced meat-free diet will deliver all those nutrients that you need anyway. So I think it's good, and I think obviously from an environmental arm as well, it's good. We know that we're supposed to all be trying to be more plant-based. That's not saying you have to be completely, and I think that's really important to highlight, but we are all trying, we encouraged to all be a bit more plant-based, because it is better for the environment. It does have an impact. And so I know that's a key feature of something that's really important to you, Shane. So I think it's important that we highlight that side of it as well. And I think it can be a good opportunity to see what your body can do, and maybe it will make you be more plant-based when you finish.
Yeah, I mean, Eleanor, who's supporting us in the background here, you could maybe post in a link to the sustainability policy we have at AREA events, which does go into the detail of our kind of food policy. That explains the rationale for it. And I'll be absolutely honest with the audience this evening. We will, and we always have, one or two participants at Dragon's Back and Cape Wrath who will complain that they don't have meat in the menu, but we have far more people who go, that menu was amazing. I can't believe you managed to produce food that good in a field for 500 people. So I guess the headline is that don't let our meat and fish free menu put you off. So thinking, Renee, next question really is thinking about our participants at the events. I think maybe the biggest question to ask is our back of the pack runners. They're out the longest, they have the least time to recover. And our fast runners at the front of the race, they can have 2 evening meals. They've got loads of time. The back of the pack runners, they have much less opportunity to fuel. So perhaps you could expand on the challenges they have and how they might deal with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, it is always challenging. If you come in and you've only got a few hours to kip and recover before you're going out again, you want to maximize your recovery at that point. So actually, having one of the things I remember when Damien did Dragon's Back for the first time, and we talked about what he should do and how he should manage it. And I said, look, the biggest tip I can give you is, like, even before you take your kit off, almost, you want to be trying to get some sort of recovery drink in as quickly as possible. So that might be something you have to bring yourself, but it's really important. But just mixing something up that you can hydrate, you can get a bit of protein in, and then you get your meal in as well, is really, really important from a recovery point of view. There was a study that came out quite a long time ago now, but it was actually looking at mountain marathons, but you can extend it to multi-day events now. And they said that one of the key reasons why participants don't usually complete is actually the dehydration element. So
Mhm.
the hydration is quite key. So again, if you can get something that gives you energy and gives you protein and hydrates you, just as soon as you stop moving, that's a really, really beneficial top tip from my point of view. And then obviously getting that meal in as well as quickly as you can. Um, and potentially if you need to, having things that are easily digestible to consume every couple of hours before you go to bed is kind of what I'd be recommending. But again, if you're drinking, and again, maybe you're drinking more of an energy-based electrolyte rather than just an electrolyte, again, that can really support your recovery and help you. And equally, when you're out on the course, it could be worth considering, if you're out for like longer than, your sort of 12 hours, it could be worth considering having uh, some protein throughout the day as well. So I'm not saying like every time you eat something, but maybe every 4 hours ago, again, that can just really sort of support the breakdown of muscle that's going on too. Um, so yeah, it's a difficult one, and it does come with challenges, but maximizing what you can take in is probably the key thing.
It's reminded me of one of my rules of thumb when I've been doing multi-day racing, and that was never to go to sleep until I can pee clear urine.
Yeah,
And even if I have to sit up another hour and drink more liquid, that's always been a golden rule for me. And it's
yeah,
just means you recover well overnight. And I
absolutely.
get the advice we always give to participants at Dragon's Back and Cape Wrath is you can do without half an hour more sleep or less sleep, but you can't do without the carbohydrates. So
Yeah,
make the time to eat because that will define your success or failure the following day.
totally, totally.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question from my list, then I'm going to jump into the questions from participants because I can see hundreds of them or
Yeah,
many of them
there's lots
flashing
coming
up.
in.
Yeah, so we'll hand over to Eleanor. But my final question was going to be about cramp, and I think every runner's experienced cramp at one point or another. There are a lot of theories out there about the causes and how to deal with cramp. And perhaps maybe you could give like a professional opinion, electrolyte or not, salt tablets or not. What would your opinion be?
So, it is a really interesting one. And actually, if we think about what cramp is fundamentally the body's way of protecting a muscle. So it does occur when a muscle is under stress. So it could be that, if you've repeatedly doing the same movement. So it can happen if you've done a lot of um climbing particularly, then that can definitely lead to cramp. So what I would say is in training, making sure you're doing plenty of support work for that sort of, heel raises and making sure you're getting in the gym and doing the things you need to do. So you're not going to be underprepared. But yes, absolutely, hydration and electrolytes can really help. So keeping on top of that again, particularly if it's particularly warm, or even if it's not warm, but actually it's a bit humid, like we've had the last few days where it's been wet, but it's been humid, you're actually going to be, I mean, I went running this morning and I was absolutely sweating and it was ridiculous. And I was just like, oh my God, I'm like properly dripping. So if you're wearing a waterproof and you were like that, you're actually losing a lot, but not always realizing. And so that in itself can be problematic. And weirdly, actually, I never suffer from cramp, but a couple of weekends ago, I supported a friend of mine who was doing the Bob Graham, and I did the um, first leg with him, and I have no idea what happened, but I got severe cramp in both my calves, which I'm still trying to work out why, because I've never ever had cramp. And I think it's a combination of obviously I'd been to Nepal and done a lot of climbing. But actually, when I reflected, please don't do what I did. When I reflected, I didn't take any electrolytes or nutrition in that first hour, which is not what you should do, people, at all. So actually, I ended up in that moment. I took quite a lot. I mean, we had to stop for a few minutes and sort of massage my calves out, and I took a lot of electrolytes in at that point and some energy. And actually, within 5 minutes, I was moving again, and it was okay. But it's just it is a combination of things. And if you're getting cramp repeatedly, so if you're always getting cramp, even in training, that is a sign that there's probably some weakness in that muscle. So it's worth just getting that checked out so that you're not going to do it more damage when you get out on the course.
Well, thank you. Eleanor, would you like to take charge and run us through the questions that are sitting there and waiting?
Yeah, we have unsurprisingly had a lot of questions, which is great. So we'll start. Someone says they struggle a lot with vomiting in any kind of fell race or round, possibly due to being anxious. Is there anything that you could advise to help with vomiting if that's something you struggle with?
So I think if it is anxiety related, then there are some like some simple exercises you can do to try and calm yourself down. Because obviously, when we're anxious, we do go into our sort of flight or flight response, and actually that means we tend to not hold anything in our stomach. So we either get diarrhea or we vomit. So trying to you regulate your emotions and regulate that can be really helpful. And a simple exercise actually say to quite a lot of my clients is literally putting your hand on your chest and just focusing on your breathing, just in and out breathing, not thinking about anything else, and just focusing on that in and out breathing, just for a minute even, can make a really big difference to sort of start calming you down. But the other thing to do maybe is to have something like a boiled sweet that can just give you a little bit of sugar to the brain. And again, often when we're anxious, the sugar's being used very, very quickly. So just making sure that the brain's got a bit of sugar, that can also help. But the question I would ask back to the individual is, if it's not anxiety related, actually, are you pushing much harder than you would normally in training? Because again, that can be an indicator of, that can also make you vomit if you're pushing much harder than you train. Normally we would train at, not for the whole thing, but you would train at certain periods of time at the intensity you're intending on going in a race. And so if you're going pushing harder, that in itself might be creating a bit more acid, which again will make you more likely to vomit. And if it's longer races, then looking at your salt intake as well, just making sure you're getting that salt balance could be quite useful.
Yep, absolutely. That's great advice. So someone has asked, how important is the 20 to 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of finishing training? Like, is that timing really important? And if so, how would you execute it in a kind of multi-day event?
So yeah, as I was saying earlier, that kind of, I mean, the 20 to 30 grams is a bit arbitrary. We generally say it's actually 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So it's based on you. So someone like me who's not particularly big, actually, it's around 15 grams of protein. So it depends on your body weight and getting that. But getting that in within that 30 minutes is really important. So again, trying to find perhaps it is a drink that you can use. So there's lots of different products on the market, like there's lots of brands. Finding one that you like the taste of, to be honest, is what I'd be recommending. At home, personally, I just tend to use like chocolate milk or iced mochas personally, but obviously when you're in a multi-day event, that's not the way. You can't always do that. So trying to find something that you can have, but again, also, become familiar with the menu, because it's possible the menu, like when you're getting a snack in the afternoon, if that sort of fits in timing with you getting across the line and being able to have that within 30 minutes, and that's got the protein in it, then actually you're sorted. So, and those sorts of things are really important. So get familiar with the process of the race and what it also provides.
Yep, definitely. And I guess what I'd say for something like the Dragon's Back race is, even if the main meal isn't being served yet, from the time that the first finishers come in, there's always soup and chips. So I mean that will always give you some kind of carbs, and the soup will usually have some kind of protein to it as well.
Yeah.
So that would be advice I'd give to people finishing that is, as soon as you come in, go straight and grab the food.
Yeah.
So the next question we have is, you've sort of touched about like people doing fasted runs before. People say that it can make you be more fat adapted. But would you definitely suggest always getting in some carb before a morning run?
Ideally, yes. So the whole fat the whole fat adaptation thinking, and I want to do it in a kind of simplified form because it is quite complicated. So we used to talk about training low, which was basically you would train in a fasted state. So you would train overnight fasted, and there was some indication that if you did this, then it could improve your ability at using more fat for fuel, particularly in endurance events. But this also got very dumbed down on social media, and people started doing basically all their runs fasted and all their training fasted. And if you go away and you look at the papers that are involved in this sort of fat adaptation, it's actually about specific timing and specific runs. So these runs need to be your recovery runs. They should never be more than 60 minutes. They should never be higher than what is known as your first ventilatory response. So that's kind of, that very easy, chatty pace. So it's a very, and you should really not do them more than twice a week. So that can support some adaptation. But if you're doing your harder runs or longer runs, and you're doing it every day, actually that can cause you more problems and actually blunten your response to carbohydrates, so that when you're in race mode, you actually don't oxidize your carbohydrate as well. So you actually don't absorb it and tolerate it as well. So I'm not a fan of fasted runs. But like I said, there's a place for them if you do it right. But and particularly for women, we know that it can be more problematic from a hormonal point of view. It can really affect their production of thyroid hormone, particularly T3, which can then lead to more issues with their menstrual cycle. So it's not something we recommend for women at all. But as what I was saying earlier is, you don't have to have like a massive bowl of porridge. We're talking, it could be a piece of toast, it could be a banana. It's just making sure there's something in the system. And if you really struggle, even having like half a gel and then taking the other half out with you and having that 20 minutes into your run, that could also work. So there are lots of options. People always go, but I can't get up and da. But actually there are quite a lot of options to make it easier for you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So someone has asked about they've heard about people eating before tackling a big climb and then feeling that their energy is really sapped while climbing because their body is sending blood to their gut to digest. And they're asking, is there any evidence to this? And is there any advice on taking nutrition on a climb?
Again, this is really individual. Like, I think, again, you can train your gut. There are a lot of people that can train their, I mean, you have to, in big races, your gut has to learn to be able to cope with moving and digesting. And so you can train your gut. I think if you have a massive meal at the bottom of a climb and then you insist on climbing, then that might be a bit more problematic. But if we're talking about, you're having, I don't know, half a bagel, or you're having a piece of pizza, if that's what you've got, or whatever, preparing before a climb is quite useful, because as I said, it can be quite difficult sometimes to eat when you're actually climbing, particularly if you're using poles, or even if you're not using poles. Just the sort of heavy work of climbing means it can be difficult to chew and eat at the same time and climb. So I would definitely suggest it's worth, if you know a climb's coming up, it's worth thinking about taking something on 10 minutes or so before, but actually also practicing that in your training, so that you know that you can do it and you know what works for you.
Yeah, I think there's nothing worse than being on a climb and actually finding you haven't fueled at all and you've got nothing in the tank. Speaking from experience there.
Yeah, definitely.
So someone has asked, when coaching your athletes, do you suggest a specific nutritional template for them to kind of complete, as it were, prior to an event?
The answer is no. I'm not a big fan of prescribing specific plans, because I think as humans we should have preference, and also we should enjoy our food. So I don't want to say you must eat X and you must do Y. But what I tend to do is give a bit of guidance in a similar way that we've talked about today. So I might give a bit more guidance on, well, it's really important that before this run you have some form of carbohydrate. Here are some examples, for examples. So I would be a bit more a little bit more prescriptive than I've been this evening, but not kind of to the point where it's absolutely calculated. Because the other thing is that it's really important that we respond to our appetite as well. Like, the human body is not a machine, right? It's kind of, this is my biggest sort of bugbear, is that the human body is constantly in a state of flux. And actually, it's very difficult to identify how much we need all the time, because sometimes our body will be repairing bone, and sometimes it will be creating red blood cells, and sometimes it will be repairing neurons in the brain, and all of this costs energy, but we don't know this is happening. And so I always sort of give people guidance and say this is probably the bare minimum, and if you notice that you are still hungry, then I would definitely encourage you to consume more. And I'd give them examples of sorts of things they could have, just to make sure it's nutrient dense and delivers what they need. But yeah, I don't tend to sort of give an absolute, you must eat X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that sounds like a good strategy. There's no one size fits all for anyone at all. Right. Someone has asked, is there any special diet that you would recommend, or any foods perhaps, to aid quicker recovery from injury, whether that's muscular or tendon or soft tissue injury?
So if you've got a tendon injury, there is some evidence that using collagen can be really helpful. So it's something I use with a lot of the athletes I work with if they do get a tendon ligament type injury. It does depend on the injury. So tendon ligament type injury, you can start to incorporate some collagen. I'm not a big fan of supplements, but there are a few that really work very well. So, and what we normally recommend is something like 10 grams of collagen in the morning. So usually 30 minutes before you might do some rehab type exercise, or you might just do some gentle walking or whatever it might be. And then you take another 5 grams before you go to bed. And often when you buy collagen, it will actually come with vitamin C. But if it doesn't, then make sure you take this with vitamin C, because that can really improve the uptake of collagen. And that has shown to speed up the recovery. It's not going to prevent things. It's not going to stop it. It's not going to kind of fix it like that, but it just can speed up the recovery. When it comes to muscle tears, it's a tricky one. I mean, rest is the best thing for obviously a muscle tear. But actually, you could think, if depending on your intake, if you have quite a low intake of essential fatty acids, so if you're not somebody who's taking omega-3s in, if you're maybe not having enough of those N3 acids, which is what we're looking for. And they're quite difficult if you're plant-based, because actually they generally come from fish. So it can be quite tricky. You might need to you might need to find a plant-based supplement that you can use, because even though we do convert some ALA into the right fatty acids, it's very, very poor conversion. So it may be in these situations that you want to increase your intake of those essential fatty acids for the muscle tear. And what was the other one? Sorry, there was 3 you said.
What was it? I think it was tendon or bone, I think was the other one.
So yeah, so with bone as well, I mean, again, depending on the state of the bone, if it's a bone stress, then one of the things I would be looking at is the potential cause of that. If you're getting bone stress or stress fractures, then we have to look at the overall picture. What's happening here? Do you have low bone density? So actually looking at, have you had a DEXA scan recently to kind of work out what's going on with that? And also, where is this coming from? Is it an overall chronic low energy availability that's maybe affecting your hormones, in particular your estrogen or your testosterone, which is really important for bone health and good bone health, and particularly as we get older as well. But also there is, again, especially as we get older, protein can be really useful in terms of bone injury. So increasing your protein intake a little bit over that period of time can improve it. Vitamin D, calcium would be things to look at.
Oh, so we've had quite a few questions about just specific carb to protein ratio. Is there kind of one perfect carb to protein ratio that you'd recommend for after training?
For after training.
Mm-hmm.
So what we normally recommend is like 3 to 1. So 3, 3 parts carb, 1 part protein. But if you want to be more scientific, for those of you that want to be more scientific, the recommendations tend to be 1.2 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight and 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So you can work that out according to you, in terms of what you need. So, you know, if you're like 60 kilos, that's like, I'll do my maths now, it's like 72 grams of carbs and about 18 grams of protein, something like that.
Okay, so that's interesting. So it could actually be a bit different, the ratio, I guess, based on body weight.
Based on your body weight, yeah.
Yeah. So what's your recommendation on timing caffeine consumption?
Good question. So caffeine works in terms of obviously it's working on your central nervous system and on the neurotransmitters. So it's basically trying to reduce your perceived exertion. So it's one of those that you have to also be really careful that you don't overdo it, because if we overdo caffeine, that can also cause palpitations and anxiety. So it's getting the dose right that's important. So firstly, the dose, and I can, of course, I'll send these all over to you, Eleanor, so you can send them out if you need to. But the dose that we normally recommend is no more than 3 milligrams of caffeine. So 3 milligrams per kilogram of body weight of caffeine, generally speaking, in a given dose, because that is kind of, if you have more than that, you're probably going to cause yourself more problems. In terms of timing, I would say it can be useful to take it before. So some people find that taking it 10-15 minutes before means that it will peak nicely as you're kind of in that first part of your run, so that can work really well. And then you might benefit from taking it sort of 4 to 5 hours later again, so that again you're getting that slight kind of pickup. And then I always tend to recommend in the last sort of 5k, it's actually worth having a bit of caffeine. Then it just makes that last 5k feel a little bit less difficult. So that's kind of roughly what I'd recommend.
I'm really glad someone asked that question, actually, because when you were answering it, I was thinking, oh, this is really useful. I need to take notes on this for sure. It's really interesting, this next question, actually. So someone's asked, thinking about women who are reaching or currently in their menopause who are participating, would your advice about salts and electrolytes be different to what you described for women who are still regularly menstruating?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The answer is, to a certain degree, yes. I mean, this sounds awful because I'm going to say this and it's going to sound really bad, but I guess you're sort of more like a man. So you're still going to have losses. You still need to be on top of them. But you don't have this fluctuating progesterone, unless, of course, you're on HRT, in which case that may influence. And so again, depending, most women who are perimenopausal, postmenopausal will be on HRT, and they tend to be on sort of a continuous dose of estrogen and then 12 days of progesterone. So if it's during those 12 days that you're taking your progesterone that your race falls, then again your salt losses might be a bit higher, because it's basically the progesterone that's the problematic aspect. So, but it's a really good question, and unfortunately there's probably no studies on this whatsoever, because postmenopausal and perimenopausal women are the least investigated in sports science, and actually studies on women in general are really poor, but this particular group is even more poor. So actually it's one that I think, when I'm asked next, get asked a lot, like, have you got a question that we should use for a dissertation or for a, I would, it's one I think I would definitely encourage them to investigate, because I think it's a really, really good question. So the answer is, most likely it's still something you need to be very aware of, but I don't know 100% because we don't have any science on it.
That's really interesting. We actually did have a webinar a couple months back, which was specifically about women in ultra running, and it came up a little bit then actually about how it is different, you know, for men and women, and that's definitely true for nutrition for sure.
Men and women are very different, and physiologically women are very different. And actually, just to give you some really quite shocking stats, presently the number of studies done on women athletes is 6% of total studies out there done on sports nutrition and sports science. So it's very, very poor. So actually it's really difficult because majority of the information that's out there is being extrapolated from that data, and it doesn't fit women. And so there's a few of us in the industry who, a lot of my advice, particularly when I'm working with women, is very much tailored to what's in front of me. So although I've given lots of advice today and it does stand, it's still very much I'd work with that person and get to know them, and we'd make it work around what they're responding and how they're responding, because that's the only way we can really do it, because we just don't have the science to back up quite a lot of it.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy, only 6%.
Yeah.
Wow. So someone has asked, what are your thoughts on training on a keto diet?
I would say read More Fuel You, because I'm quite clear about my thoughts on it. I'm not a big fan of keto diets. I think there's a place for them in certain clinical conditions, and that's where they have become popularized. And if you know, again, it's really important to understand where these claims have come from, and then how they've been sort of you know, brought into the world as sport. I don't know if I can say much more. I'm not a fan of keto diets for endurance athletes, because in the long run it causes more problems um, than benefits. That said, there will always be the odd person that will do well on it, and that will be very much the approach they want to do. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. If it works for you, that's fine. But I think please do have a read of the book, because it does highlight some of the potential risks of doing it. And that's more, and as I've said in the book quite succinctly, I'm never going to stop somebody from doing what they want to do. But actually, if you know the potential risks and you know what to look out for that could indicate that it's not working for you, then at least you've got a backup of understanding why. So it's not something I ever promote. But yeah, I know a lot of people do.
Yeah. So what would you suggest with regards to eating real food on a run? What kinds of food are good for running?
I mean,
A very general question there.
Yeah, it's kind of what you fancy. I mean, I wouldn't have spaghetti bolognese or something like that, but you know, I think, although Shane's going,
well, I'll let you know,
not?
one of my little running secrets is I quite like to put like leftover pasta, like spaghetti and some pesto, and wrap it up in a like tortilla wrap, and then you have like spaghetti wraps. Blooming heck, that's good
Interesting.
for long, slow runs.
Well, I've never tried that. It's one to try. It's one to add to my list. Like I said, I think things like bagels, things like wraps, salted potatoes, mashed potatoes, pizza, all of these are really, really good, to be honest. And you sort of find your own. You find what works. A lot of people like, I know Damien's a big fan of avocado wraps. He has a lot of those. Yeah, I tend to just stick with Marmite. So that, you know, that's kind of where I go to. Salted potatoes are massive. They're a real big one for me. Flapjacks, if you need something sweet, they're also quite good. Yeah, I think I mean, I know I've got friends who eat pork pies. I mean, I personally wouldn't, but you know, it is what works for you. And it's what I think, like I said earlier, it's really important that it's something you fancy. It's something you crave. I mean, I often crave crisps quite a lot. And again, I think it's the salted peanuts, all of these things are, you know, are all good. And the salted peanuts also help because they get a little bit of protein in there as well. They can be, yeah, pretty good as well. Or cheesy oat cakes, as I found in Nepal. But you know,
I always love hearing like the massively wide variety of like different things that people eat. Like definitely I could not eat beans on a run and get cold beans. I know is something
Yeah,
that
people
works for
do, and
some
people have
people.
rice pudding. And actually, when
Yeah.
I did UTS 50 a couple of years ago, and I got to this aid station, and I I was so hungry at this point, and I literally there was so much food, and I was like, I just want it all. But of course, I couldn't have it all, and I was so hungry, and I was looking at it all, going, I don't know what I want, I don't want. And then the woman behind, she was lovely, and she's like, what is it you fancy? Like, I don't know. She goes, I've just made a cheese and pickle sandwich for myself. I said, can I have it? And she just gave it to me. So you just never quite know. Like suddenly that was exactly what I wanted, was a cheese and pickle sandwich. So bless her, she gave me her cheese and pickle sandwich, which was brilliant. So like you never know what you're gonna want.
That's excellent.
Shall we ask one more question, Eleanor? Why don't you
Yeah.
choose the best one that we've got left?
Well, I've only got 2 more questions left.
Oh, let's
so
do them both then.
Do them
Okay.
both, yeah.
We've got, does beetroot juice have any proven benefits?
So really interesting, actually. I've just written an article for Runner's World on this. So I have the up-to-date information. So it used to be that when it first came out, so it was originated from Exeter University, and it was Andy Jones who was really looking at how beetroot juice might be able to help with oxygen uptake, which means that you can increase your stamina fundamentally. And then over the years, it was like discredited. It was like, no, this definitely doesn't work for endurance. It tends to work better for, sort of multiple sprints. So footballers and hockey players tend to benefit from it more. So reading the most recent research, it was really interesting. So what they've said is that actually particularly in the kind of ultra distance and multi-stage, there is some evidence that actually taking the dose that you need, and it does have to be that sort of I think it's 6 millimoles of nitrate. So you have to take the actual beetroot shot rather than just eating loads of beetroot. If you take that for 15 days, so you take that in the lead up to and then during, and they say ideally you time it around 90 minutes before you start running, that seems to have a benefit for runners. That was the latest study that I read and I have written about. So, but it won't be out for ages because I write these columns like months in advance. So don't expect it next month. Just putting that out there. So there is some benefit to taking beetroot juice now, it seems. The thing about beetroot juice, I'd say, is that it's not going to do you any harm. Apart from maybe staining your wee, it's not going to do you any harm. So if you did want to take it, and it feels like it works for you, then go for it. But obviously there is a cost to that, so
Interesting. Like, yeah, the most up-to-date advice there. Right, okay, so final question. Do you recommend continuing to drink electrolytes at camp in the evening as well as during the day when running?
yeah, I would do. And like I was saying, depending on where you finish, you might want to, if you're finishing later on, you might want to combine that with carbs, so you're still getting that energy in as well. But actually, if you're kind of a front runner and you can get enough energy in through food, then yeah, definitely take the electrolytes. It just helps you to absorb that fluid back in better, and it means that you're not sloshing around as well from drinking too much.
Wow,
Thanks
that's
so much.
been thanks, Eleanor. That's been a tour de force of expert commentary, which has been really joyful to listen to. And I think there's been quite a lot of questions. There's a couple that are unanswered, and there's also been questions about what ratio was this or what was that. And what we will do is we'll put this webinar online, and it'll go on the Dragon's Back YouTube channel. I'm not quite sure when, Eleanor. I know we're quite busy with Cape Wrath Ultra next week.
I think I can probably put it on tomorrow.
Oh, wow. Perfect. Well, there you go.
Wow.
So if anybody wants to rewatch it and get into the detail of some of Renee's recommendations, it will be online tomorrow. I'm going to plug Renee's book again. I'm a couple of pages away from finishing it. It's been one of those really simple easy reads that's full of, you know, good science and good advice, and it's just been a pleasure to read, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, so I definitely recommend that. I would like to thank Renee very much for her time this evening. We're looking forward to seeing her at the Dragon's Back at some point. We know it's
Yes,
on the tick list.
it is.
Eleanor,
Yes.
thank you for your time this evening. And if you are interested in our big expedition races, you can watch the Cape Wrath Ultra unfold starting from Sunday next week, so about 10 days away. Brilliant. We'll finish there. Thank you, everybody.